Muchas gracias, señor Youssef. Vamos a empezar el debate.
Thank you very much indeed. We're going to embark on our debate in a moment. We're going to give members an opportunity to participate in a minute or two. But first of all, I'd like to give Mr. Ali Sindi the opportunity to speak. He's the Minister of Planning from Kurdistan.
Shall I speak from here? Rojbash, Excellencies, Speaker of Iraqi Parliament, Chairman Brok, Madam Makaban, Commissioner Stylianides, Dr. Tony Lake, Dr. Chan, distinguished European Parliament members, I would like to thank you all and the United Nations for hosting this timely meeting. We are surrounded by conflict, violence and radicalization. While I appreciate inviting me to participate, we in Iraqi Kurdistan are very concerned to be kept away from some of the global dialogue on security and combating terrorism in our region. Today, Kurdistan is fighting terrorism with Peshmerga's boats on the ground in a war front of more than 100 kilometers, where more than 1,300 Peshmergas murdered and more than 6,000 wounded since the beginning of this conflict. And herewith I'd like to ask the help of the individual country members to help in treating the wounded Peshmergas. I am here representing Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq to support the United Nations appeal for funding the humanitarian response plan for the whole Iraq. While many parts of Iraq are now destabilized, let me focus on Kurdistan region as I am representing the regional government there. People and government of Kurdistan region are now both at the front lines of war and peace at the same time. War with forces of ISIS and building peace by hosting large numbers of Syrian refugees and Iraqi IDPs. From 2005 onwards, waves of Iraqis moved from different parts of Iraq to Kurdistan. In 2012, Kurdistan opened its doors to refugees from Syria and kept its doors open. In the second half of 2014, within the space of few months, close to 1 million of our Iraqi sisters and brothers, Christians, Yazidis, Kurds, Turkmens, Arabs entered the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Today, at least 1 out of 4 persons in our region is displaced from elsewhere. In the whole governorate, the ratio is close to 1 out of 2, and the ratio is narrowing as more displaced people are arriving while I am talking here. So far, a community of 5 million is hosting around 1.7 displaced Iraqis and Syrian refugees, and both communities are affected and in need of support. Internationally, you do not mix IDPs with refugees, but in our government, while looking at their needs, we do that because they are from the same origin and have the same needs in terms of support and help. Please take a moment to absorb these figures and imagine how you would respond if this sudden increase in population had occurred in your constituency. We have built more than 30 camps, towns, but are struggling in funding and managing the operation. Nevertheless, we still have a large population of internally displaced people living in very bad conditions in unfinished buildings and other unsuitable shelters. Many of them have become destitute over time, and where host Kurdish families have extended support, they are now overstretched and unable to do more. 2/3 of IDP children and half of the refugees' children are not enrolled in any educational programs. Tens of thousands of women and young girls are at risk, not necessarily for their lives, but to their well-being. The impact on the Kurdistan region of Iraq has been profound. Poverty rates has more than doubled, standard of living has dropped, food security is affected, health situation deteriorated, with threats of cholera in certain areas in the months of summer to come. And many other public services are disrupted too. The situation in Kurdistan is a mixture of emergency and resilience at the same time. According to a World Bank assessment on the social and economic impact of the crisis on the Kurdistan region conducted end of 2014 and beginning of 15, GDP growth has dropped from 8% in 2013 to 3% in 2014. Unemployment has surged, and the access of refugees and IDPs into the labor market is pushing wages down. The bank projects the overall stabilization cost from the inflow of refugees and IDPs to Kurdistan region to be at least $1.4 billion for the year 2015. This number is an additional budget to what we are here for today. 1.4 billion is the cost of stabilization for the Kurdistan regional government, in addition to the 500 million that the UN is appealing for funding. And as earlier Barbara Noseworthy mentioned, the cost of inaction might really be much more than the cost of action. Now, for a moment, think about the link between stabilization in conflict areas and migration to Europe. And think about it and see whether there is a link or not. We in Kurdistan have done what we can, and we deserve some credits and more attention. At a time when our own fiscal situation is precarious, we do not have the ability to maintain the infrastructure in camps or provide the full range of public services to IDPs or affected host population. Our civil servants and Peshmerga forces have not received salaries for the past 3 months. You will agree with me that this situation is untenable. We are and will try all the measures to fix our economy. Iraq, being considered a middle-income country, with the drop of oil and the war on ISIS and many other reasons, today the finance situation is very complicated. In the months to come, the fight against ISIS will inevitably lead to more displacement. As I am speaking before you today, I am not confident that we are all collectively prepared to respond to such renewed population displacements, being them from Ramadi, Mosul, or elsewhere. The people and government of the Kurdistan region have shown tremendous generosity over an extended period of time and kept doors open for IDPs and refugees, but we are reaching a breaking point. We need the support of the EU and individual European countries to fund the United Nations appeal, but also to help Kurdistan government militarily, humanitarian-wise, and support developing our economy. Without a strong and sustained support from the international community, we will not be able to cope. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Sindi. We talk constantly in this committee about the attempts in Kurdistan to protect the civilian population and to deal with the terrorist incidents there. So thank you very much for your words. We appreciate it very much. We're going to embark on a debate shortly, but we have with us also Mr. Brian House, who's Vice President of the European Parliament delegation with Iraq.
Thank you indeed, President, and I'd like to welcome everyone today to the European Parliament for this extraordinary meeting, and I think also to hear at first hand the testimony earlier about the appalling situation that people face in Iraq and the international responsibility that exists here and across the world to resolve that situation and to provide the support for people who have had to face that situation and that tragedy for so many years. Can I just begin by echoing some of the remarks made by our colleagues from Kurdistan and on two net issues. One, given the number of IDPs within Kurdistan and the very significant burden that is placing on basic public services, we do have a responsibility within Iraq, but especially within Kurdistan, to deliver for the government and for the people there, given their very open and tolerant response to the number of IDPs that are within the region. But secondly, can I say that we also have a responsibility, and Baghdad has a responsibility, to deliver on their budgetary commitments and promises in respect of financing and funding. And I think the situation would be greatly improved in terms of the diplomatic issues if those commitments were honoured. And I think it's only right and important to say that at a meeting such as this today. Chairman, the UN-led humanitarian funding in Iraq, including the one foreseen in the previously presented revised humanitarian response plan, could be a vehicle not only, in my view, for crucially important humanitarian assistance, but also for a much greater promotion of stability within the region and enhancing the chances for the success of a national reconciliation process in Iraq, something that I believe all Europeans support. Such a result could be achieved, in my view, and I think in the view of our delegation, by inviting the often antagonising actors within the region, such as Turkey, Iran and Saudi Arabia, to co-fund the UN humanitarian planning and to actively participate in its definition and in the implementation phases. This approach would give to the three above-mentioned regional players, significant players in their own right, the possibility to sit around the same table in a neutral environment and to discuss together with other funding partners, such as ourselves in Europe, in much closer coordination with the government of Iraq, about the humanitarian priorities for the country. Now, in my view, the EU could be a mediator in this process. Such a strategy involving other regional actors would be great help, I know, also to the Iraq Prime Minister, who is currently pursuing a consistent diplomatic effort in order to enhance the quality of Iraqi relations with its regional neighbours and its immediate neighbours. And it's in the quality of that engagement that I think our discussions today could help. My questions to the panel are therefore, to what extent have Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries been involved in the definition of the revised UN humanitarian response plan for Iraq? To what extent are they participating in the plan? What is the amount of their current financial contributions? They are wealthy countries in their own right. Do they have the possibility to co-define programmes and actions stemming from the plan in coordination with the government of Iraq? And if not, what are the possibilities in establishing such a new era of cooperation as a consequence of the humanitarian plan that we want to put in place? I think were we to get the support of the regional actors to this process and to the regional countries, I think it would greatly help not just the humanitarian relief, but the ongoing process of reconciliation within the region. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Y ahora
Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Gomez.
Thank you. I also am grateful for the organization of this panel, which is focusing on humanitarian response and is obviously aiming at getting EU financial assistance for that, which I very much support. But I have to say that we in the EU are wrong to actually look at Iraq only from the humanitarian angle and actually think that we can get away with our responsibilities only focusing on the humanitarian. It's good for our ego or for our conscience, but it's definitely not enough to deal with the tremendous problem we have there, where we have responsibilities for action and for inaction. I'm focusing on humanitarian. I'm grateful for Mr. Turk, who has mentioned the tremendous sense of solidarity of the people of Iraq. I've seen that. I've been last January, I did all the way from Erbil to Dohuk to visit IDP camps and to talk to the authorities. And I've seen that generosity, that it's amazing indeed. And it's really quite heartbreaking to sense that most of the Europeans don't understand what is there at stake. Not only the effort of the Iraqi people, but actually how they are defending our security, because indeed a front line of the fight against terrorism now is happening in Iraq and is very much linked to the mess in Syria, and we have responsibilities as well for the mess in Syria, as we have in Iraq. So focusing on the humanitarian, I am outraged. I was outraged, and I was not alone. I went with 3 more colleagues here in the European Parliament. We wrote to High Representative Mogherini to highlight how, even in the humanitarian field, much more had to be done. We were quite upset to see that, for instance, most of the formal camps, IDP camps, don't have schools, because, of course, the Iraqi authorities have not the capacity, the Kurdish authorities don't have the capacity to do that. And you have thousands of kids and young people without schooling. It's terrible. It's actually fabricating more recruits for terrorism. It's absolutely ridiculous that with the EU paying heavily for this humanitarian effort, indeed, we're not assuring that schooling is there. And it is actually the result of lack of coordination inside the EU itself, among ECHO and the EU member states, who are there, who are involved, but there's no coordination. So this is a serious problem which we highlighted to Ms. Mogherini, and we highlighted, of course, to Commissioner Stylianides. I hope there is now at least some coordination at the level of the High Representative and the Commissioners. I was also struck, and we were struck by the fact that there were lots of informal refugee IDP camps, because the needs, the resources are not there for everybody. And of course these people are bitterly complaining, and some of them are next to each other. And the situation is quite difficult for them in terms of basic needs like water, clean water and so on. I was also very upset with the fact that I haven't seen any program to, for instance, help rescue the people who have been kidnapped, mostly girls and kids. And there is a program that is running by the Iraqis, by the Kurdish networks, But I'm surprised, and I'd like to ask whether the ICRC or whoever can help indeed and can answer if there is some international assistance to a program which could be mounted, and that, by the way, would be very, very important also politically, because there is a lot of very interesting information that the people who get out, the girls who get out, like the Yazidi girls with whom we talked, could actually supply and would make very relevant the information for other purposes. I'm also shocked that there is not a program to actually help these people. It's not just the wounded Peshmerga and other fighters who need medical special treatment, but actually these girls who have been managed to, who are tremendously traumatized, who need special assistance. It's outrageous that indeed we in the EU did not put up a program to specifically help these people and treat them and often out of the community where they are now living, and they're not living with their families for very terrible reasons. I also think that indeed another area where we needed coordination is actually all the problem regarding resettlement. I very much agree with what the Minister Sindi has just said, that there is a clear link between what we are watching now with migration in the Mediterranean and what is happening, including in Iraq. And all the people that we talk, Christians or Yazidis, they told us, we are going to come to Europe whenever we can. It's just a matter of time. We are going to come to Europe. We can't live here. Of course, at the same time, we had other people, and namely the leaders of these religious communities, telling us it's about not just the survival of the people, it's about the survival of these pre-Islamic cultures here in Iraq. So we don't want people to get out. More important that indeed help the people to resettle here. But of course this requires basic needs. I mean, I saw schools near the main church in Erbil, not schools, IDP camp in the churchyard of the main church in Erbil, and also there, even there, difficulties with schooling. So how can these people think that they have conditions, that they have future in Iraq, if indeed the basics are not asserted? And of course this also requires, I mean, we've been told of ridiculous programs that some EU countries are running, for instance, for specific migration programs for Christians. This is totally counterproductive. This is exactly the opposite of what the religious Christian leaders told us. Help the people who need, temporarily, but don't help deroot them out of Iraq. Give them conditions to stay in Iraq. And of course this will, sooner or later, will pose the questions of when these people will have the conditions to resettle more permanently or to go back to their countries, and the international guarantees they will need. This leads me to my last point. I also think that the EU, and I'm talking about the EU because of course has particular responsibilities and could do a much better job, and is not doing what it needs in terms of the political assistance, even the security assistance to those Iraqis who are fighting like the Peshmerga. I was absolutely shocked to find out that the EU countries who are involved and who are, for instance, supplying military equipment to the Kurdish forces are not coordinating among themselves. This is ridiculous. Those who are involved in training in Iraq, training the Iraqi forces, are not coordinating among themselves. I don't know if they are coordinating in the wider international coalition run by the United States. I know they are not coordinating among themselves. And therefore, they are not making the difference that they could make. And that is really untenable because, as I have said, and the others have said, this is the front line of our security. And of course, I would succumb very much to my colleague in as well the questions regarding neighbors of Iraq who have played a very negative role in actually fueling those who are the forces of terrorism now in Iraq. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Gómez.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gomez. I'd asked to put myself on the speakers list also, not in my capacity as chairman, because I am also the spokesman for the Izquierda Unida group. I think that we're all aware this has been an absolute disaster. It's been a natural disaster. There have been criminal activities, actions perpetrated. There have been huge problems. But sometimes it looks as if the cure was worse than the original illness, because look at the number of people who've lost their lives in Iraq. Look at the terrible situation. In 2006, a study was done on mortality in Iraq by the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, which talked about 600,000 Iraqis having lost their lives. And now projections are 1.4 million and rising. This is a terrible situation. The minister is completely correct in what he's saying about funds. When some of the funds were not distributed in Al-Bar, in that province, and the funds were used in order to combat terrorism very effectively, then what happened was that the terrorists simply went out into the desert and were able to coordinate, and many other people joined them. And therefore, the problem has simply burgeoned. So I think our action has been irresponsible and has contributed to the terrible situation. And we've simply compounded the problem by what we did in Libya. So we've created chaos, and we really need to look at what we're going to do about it. There are 4 million IDPs in Iraq, and there are 2 million in Syria as well. I'm told by my friends who've actually been there exactly what the situation is on the ground. The Red Cross and the United Nations are doing everything that they can, but there are 2 million refugees in Syria who need to be helped, and many other people too. We have had contacts with the Syrian government. We've tried to ascertain what the best way of trying to resolve the situation is, but it's a very uphill struggle. And Missouri is not managing to create an environment of peace in the way that we would have hoped. We might hope that we're now in a situation where it might be easier for us to identify who the enemy is, but the thing is, the enemy is so widespread. It is IS, it is Daesh, and it's a terrorist organization, and it is spread widely throughout the whole of the Middle East now, and we're going to have to use every legal means we can to combat these people. I think we do need to make a very public appeal for funding now. I really don't want to take too long. I'd allocated myself 3 minutes, so now I'm going to stop, and I'm going to give Edward Derard from Médecins Sans Frontières the floor. He'd asked to speak. I'm not sure where you are, sir.
Thank you very much, and very good morning to all. It's very good to be here and to have a chance on behalf of Médecins Sans Frontières to say a word at this important conference. Most of the things that were to be said by us has been said, and so the only point I would like to make very quickly is to emphasize that, of course, funding is absolutely needed, but funding is needed and required only if access is there. So the point that has been made, but that I would like to emphasize, is the need for unhindered humanitarian access, safe access, which means as well access that doesn't have to be renegotiated each time we try to reach a newly liberated area, and all efforts have to be there for humanitarian agencies to access these vulnerable populations. More could be done in that sense, and this is very much the message we wanted to convey today. The rest, I think, has been very clearly said, and again, thank you very much for letting us this opportunity.
Muchas gracias. Ahora le voy a...
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Alan Bowman, who is the ambassador to Canada here in the European Union.
I'm back here. Thank you very much. I wanted to start by thanking the organizers for inviting Canada to participate in this international meeting on Iraq. We are very much concerned by the crisis and an important contributor to humanitarian assistance there, and we intend to continue to do so in the future, working very closely with both the EU and the UN and all the agencies that are represented at this meeting. As we're in Brussels, I would like to underline in particular Canada's interest in working closely with the EU in addressing this humanitarian crisis and beyond. We are very strong partners across the board on humanitarian issues, and we intend to certainly strengthen and continue that relationship. Canada is deeply concerned by the violence in Iraq and its humanitarian consequences on millions of people affected by the crisis. We condemned in the strongest terms the targeting of civilian and religious minorities and are deeply concerned by reports of possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. We call on all parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law. We also call on authorities to allow safe and unimpeded passage for civilians fleeing conflict zones and unrestricted access for humanitarian organizations to territory under their control, the point just made by our friend from Médecins Sans Frontières. The Government of Canada is committed to providing life-saving humanitarian support for those affected by the ongoing crisis in Iraq. To this end, Canada has provided a total of $107 million in humanitarian assistance to humanitarian partners in Iraq responding to the current crisis. Of this amount, $80 million has been provided since the beginning of this year, of which $40 million was provided in response to the fast-track priorities for Iraq launched in February 2015. Canada is committed to addressing Iraq's longer-term needs in addition to the immediate humanitarian crisis, and another $23 million in recently announced development assistance programming will improve access to services and strengthen the resilience of communities and government institutions. In this way, their capacity to meet the population's needs in an inclusive and effective manner will be strengthened now and in the future. Canadian humanitarian assistance funding is supporting the provision of food, clean water, sanitation, shelter, education opportunities for conflict-affected children, healthcare, and other basic services, and also is dedicated to addressing sexual and gender-based violence. We are very concerned that the strategic response plan and the fast-track priorities outlined earlier today have not yet received the level of donor support that one might expect for an L3 crisis. So we certainly welcome the launch of this new humanitarian response plan for Iraq and hope that it will help humanitarian organizations in Iraq raise the funds that they need to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance to conflict-affected Iraqis. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my statement, we certainly have responded and will continue to do so in the future. I do have one question, as this is supposed to be structured as a Q&A session. We would be grateful for more clarity on how the humanitarian response plan will work together with the strategic response plan and the fast-track priorities. How do these three pieces of the puzzle work together to ensure efficient provision of assistance? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Ahora le voy a dar la palabra.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to give the floor to Kelly Clements, who's the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Population. 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm up here in the middle, in the yellow. Thank you very much to the European Union and the United Nations for organizing this important opportunity to put the spotlight on Iraq and the enormous human needs in the country. The United States has been a strong supporter of vulnerable Iraqis in the region, and we are pleased that the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government are strong partners in addressing the needs of Iraqi civilians forced from their homes by conflict. Since the start of the crisis in Iraq, the U.S. has also been a strong contributor to the efforts of many of the organizations here and the government, providing more than $407 million in humanitarian assistance to displaced Iraqis, including $208 million this year alone. And much of that was announced during the recent visit of the Prime Minister to Washington. We've talked a lot about funding shortfalls this morning, and the extraordinary needs continue to far outpace those humanitarian needs and the international community's response. We heard from Lise Grande and others the time to respond is now, given the critical breaking point facing aid programs in Iraq today. And we urge immediate response for the urgent needs of nearly 3 million internally displaced. The humanitarian response must be prepared, the community must be prepared to respond immediately to additional displacements, and we want to pay credit to the rapid response mechanism which we have supported together with ECHO, but these funds will be exhausted by the end of next month and deserve immediate support. We appreciate the complex and painful process the clusters the clusters of the humanitarian system, undertook to produce the humanitarian response plan that Lee's outlined this morning. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all those that worked tirelessly and at great personal risk to provide critical aid to displaced Iraqis and others affected by the conflict. Given the brutal prioritization process required to achieve this response plan, interagency coordination and cooperation is more critical than ever. We're very pleased to see the emphasis on the whole of Iraq approach. In addition to the IKR, for example, we see needs critical also in South and Central Iraq. We particularly applaud the unprecedented inclusion of an exit strategy and its close connection with the government of Iraq's responsibilities for its people. So thank you for that. And to echo several speakers this morning, access for IDPs for us remain a critical priority. Recognizing security concerns, we need to find a way to balance security constraints and humanitarian principles. This is imperative as we anticipate significant future displacement as additional areas are contested and which were outlined this morning. We're extremely concerned IDPs will have nowhere safe to flee. Also crucial that all IDPs, regardless of ethnic or religious affiliation, be allowed to return to their homes safely and voluntarily. We thank you again for this opportunity and the opportunity to be with you today.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I think we did have other people who wanted to take the floor, but since we need to have responses from our panellists, I think I can't take any more questions just now. We've got 10 or 15 minutes for the panellists to respond. I don't know who'd like to start. Would anybody like to volunteer to be first to respond to the issues raised?
Just thank you very much. I'd like to respond to a couple of questions, in particular from, I think, the Vice President and Madame Gomez. I think it is important that it is to bear in mind how this humanitarian response plan came about. It is obviously one coordinated by the DSRSG with the UN agencies and the non-governmental organizations based on fundamental humanitarian principles. And in that regard, it is clear that we are not involving countries from the region to respond to the very acute civilian needs. And this is part of what humanitarianism is about. It has to be based on these principles. And I think we need to make sure that this is indeed maintained in order to preserve these principles. I'd just like to make one comment on Turkey, because you mentioned Turkey. We have 1.7 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. They have, the last number of registration is about 92,000 Iraqis in addition, apart from Afghans and other refugee populations. I think one needs to bear in mind, and the Turkish Parliament has actually passed, despite the fact that we have a mass influx of refugees, an asylum law where the authorities have taken over a lot of the functions that previously rested with UNHCR. I think we need to bear and honor that particular contribution that Turkey has made over the years, in particular to the refugee cause, and they have provided enormous resources for the refugee response. And if indeed they were not to provide that, you would see a lot more people ending up in a lot of European countries. On the response to sexual and gender-based violence, I think that Madame Gomez mentioned the response plan, the humanitarian response plan there's a very strong component of that. And in fact, there have been a lot of activities on that front by many actors. It's clear that it's in close coordination also with the Kurdistan government to precisely respond to the very particular needs of, in particular, women and girls who have suffered often atrocious forms of sexual violence. And the third point, I think, is the resettlement component, and that's perhaps just a global comment from my side, from the UNHCR side. We had about 80,000 departures on resettlement last year globally. Europe, EU countries had about 8,500. So indeed, there is a tremendous need to ensure that the resettlement quota that the EU countries provide are going to need to increase. The Commission just presented a very important proposal that we fully support of a resettlement quota of 20,000. I think this is just the beginning. We will need a lot more resettlement as a response to, in particular, some of these refugee crises.
Muchas gracias. Ahora me había pedido la palabra la señora Naus.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nuzlevy.
To respond to the comment about school feeding, in Iraq, Syria, the Syria region, South Sudan, CAR, and numerous places around the world, we risk an entire generation coming to believe that violence is an answer, that the way to get ahead is through conflict. So what we do at the World Food Program, when the funding is available, and we are a completely voluntarily funded organization, we provide homegrown, we work with local governments and communities to address school feeding programs for boys and girls, because we think it's important to keep children in school, to learn another path. So we do have programs in Syria and in South Sudan and in some of the hardest places in the world, because we recognize that we need to provide food security and educate, and we work closely with our other agencies, let me say that. We try to be very closely connected with UNICEF and others to ensure that we don't lose a generation. So I want to recognize your comment of the importance of that, and we're dealing with that in a very evolving crisis situation, but we recognize the importance of keeping children in school. I'd also like to address the comment on Turkey as well. Our experience has been that the government of Turkey has been very generous in its response in addressing issues around food security. So I want to highlight what my colleague said. Thank you.
Ahora me ha pedido la palabra el señor Egeland.
Mr. Egeland.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Many good points were made. I am glad a number of speakers emphasized the importance for a push for the political solution, because Europe can help foster grounds for that, dialogue, get regional powers, international powers to pull together instead of being rivals in Iraq. Everybody can do more for that, neighbors, regional actors, international actors. What I think we're seeing now is a domino effect of bad things causing new bad things. People are displaced again and again. They are marginalized. They are polarized. The stable elements that exist are undermined. Extremism has a field day when everybody loses hope. So what we do not do in the next few months, we may regret for decades. We could see much worse conflicts and displacements taking place, and then it is really uncontrollable. And when even then, as the US delegate said, the rapid response mechanism that many of us, including NGOs, are part of, is running out of money, it's the sign of how desperate it is and how actually we may end up not doing anything for people. And then hope is gone, and then everything can happen. Education, and may I end on that, I agree with the speaker who emphasized the importance of education. If you ask displaced people, very often they surprisingly say, what I really hope is that my children will get into school so that we don't lose this generation. Education is hope, and it's in our plan. So fund the plan, help us, and also help this political process. Then we may turn the corner. It is not hopeless. Iraq is not hopeless. We can definitely go towards better days.
Ahora tiene la palabra el señor Josep.
I don't want to add to all the answers that we just heard. I think I completely agree. Second, I wouldn't be able to respond to the questions related to the HRP. What I want to say and repeat is that the conflict, as I made in my introduction, the conflict in Iraq has been here since very, very long time. It's not something that was created 18 months ago, where the Kurdistan regional government, the Iraqi government has been suffering since quite some time. And whatever we're doing today as international organizations is only putting somehow a Band-Aid on a wound. Sustainability is key, and I think it is part of everyone's program. I hear to emphasize on the durability of this conflict. I think we have a representative of the Anbar Governorate with us, himself probably a displaced, to tell us since when the problems started in the Anbar Governorate. So I don't think we just need to look at this current conflict and this appeal only by a limited eye, but think that this will have repercussions in the future, will definitely have repercussions in the future, as it has been the case since quite some time now. Thank you.
Y ahora le voy a dar la palabra.
Now, Ms. Kyung Wan Kang, who is the Deputy Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Aid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all speakers and from the podium and certainly the audience for very good comments. Just one question from, I think, the Ambassador of Canada. How does this relate to the SRP that was launched for 2 years last year? This is a new approach. The situation has greatly deteriorated, and this is the response plan of the country team on the ground on a real minimalistic, bare-bone approach to what is needed urgently. And the plan is, after the 6 months that this plan covers, then there will be another emergency plan. Thank you once again, the European Parliament, for bringing us all together and providing us this august venue to bring the focus on Iraq. It was a much-needed focus, much-needed attention, and much-needed show of solidarity for the people of Iraq at this difficult time. You've heard the full story, what the humanitarian situation is, the suffering of the people, and I must say we should all compliment our workers on the ground, led by Lise Grande, who's doing excellent work under extremely difficult, dangerous circumstances with whatever mechanisms they can mobilize to reach as many people in need as possible. And I think the rapid response mechanism was mentioned several times and throughout the morning's discussion. I think the HRP is one of the very best documents that certainly I have seen in terms of an appeal. It is really well thought through. Lise has exercised a great deal of rigor in presenting this document to us, so I think it's really needed the full support of all here. It's an extremely difficult circumstance where the minimum standards of warfare, as enshrined in humanitarian law, and the very basic dignity of people as enshrined in human rights law, is routinely violated, and then that's the protection challenge. And I think that is the reason why the protection challenge and the chapter is so prominent in this new humanitarian response plan. The situation, we all say, is going to get worse. Meanwhile, we have an obligation to deliver for the people who still have hope, as I think one of the panelists say, hope that someone will come and protect them. And Tony, you said, we have an obligation to keep that hope up, despite the situation that will get worse in the coming months. We desperately appeal to the political and the security actors to bring this devastation to an end, to this violence to an end. Meanwhile, please help us, please fund this so that we can help the people of Iraq who need that help now. So thank you for all of your expressions of support. Once again, thank you, the European Parliament and the ECHO, for co-hosting this with us. And we take heart in this debate and the discussion, and we will certainly convey that message of solidarity to the people of Iraq. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Y para...
Thank you very much indeed. We have the privilege of having Mr. Stylianides here with us. He's a Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, and he's going to wind up for us.
Dear friends, many thanks to Assistant Secretary General Kang and all speakers at the event. You gave us a comprehensive overview of the humanitarian challenges in Iraq. You presented the key elements which are needed for a stronger humanitarian engagement. Engagement of the international community as a whole. As we heard from Lisa Grande, the new humanitarian response plan for Iraq provided with clarity the needed humanitarian assistance until the end of the year. What Anthony Lake told us about the suffering of children is appalling. The government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government are confronted with a major challenge to sustain their efforts and to sustain coordination to ensure humanitarian assistance, to provide basic services to affected populations, always irrespective of religion, community or identity. This is a very critical message. The international community cannot abandon the victims of the Iran conflict. But we must act now, not tomorrow. As I said during my opening remarks, we must guarantee safe and unconditional humanitarian access. Very important and very difficult. Liz, you know better than me. We must secure the delivery of aid. We must do all we can to protect people in need without discrimination. Support must be granted based on the humanitarian principles, based on needs. All parties to the conflict must comply with their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. They must respect and protect all civilians. Addressing humanitarian needs is a moral obligation, as many of you already mentioned. It is a moral imperative. But beyond that, it is a precondition for security and stability. Not only for the whole country, but also for the whole of the region, maybe globally. Without addressing these needs, we risk creating fertile ground for further conflict. It would leave civilians as a prey to terrorist organizations like ISIL. The vicious circle of violence will continue. Dear friends, Europe's solidarity with Iraq is solid. It is tangible. This is the message I will bring during my mission to the people of Iraq and, of course, to their government. The EU funding is a concrete expression of our commitment. Last year, the European Commission and EU member states, the European Union as a whole, were the second largest humanitarian donor in Iraq. Until now this year, we have allocated over 38 million euros in humanitarian funding. The escalation of the fighting is putting additional pressure to the limited humanitarian resources. This is the reality. In response to this, the European Union has encouraged its partners to ensure the provision of essential assistance, water, food sanitation and hygiene items, especially in the areas where most displaced people have sought safety. I'm proud to tell you that today I have announced additional 25 million euros of humanitarian aid in Iraq. This is the amount I do now. Let me be clear. Our commitment is long-term. We must stay engaged as long as there are needs. The European Union will continue to be at the forefront of the response for as long as it takes. Not only financially, but also by advocating for the respect of international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles, by promoting political solutions. But to that end, we need to join hands, to work together. We need collective support because the responsibility is also collective. And so must be our actions. Only in this way we will be able to make a real difference. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, comisario.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner. I'd like to extend my thanks to all the participants and everybody who's taken the floor, and let us hope that this meeting will really serve as a cry for help, and we will all shoulder the responsibility that is clearly ours in respect of Iraq, and help all the organisations that are helping so much. I'd like to conclude this meeting now. The next meeting of the committee will be for development will be 15th and 16th in June, and for AFET 11th of June in Strasbourg. Thank you very much. The meeting stands adjourned.